often, as journalists, you like to write stories and explain stories about other people. How has it been for you being at the heart of the story yourself?
Well, I don't want this to be about me or actually Matt Hancock. It's about something much bigger than that. It's about events that affected every single one of us in this country, and for which I think almost everybody wants answers. We want to know what went wrong, what went right, where mistakes were made, how policies were decided. Were they really based on the science? Could we have done things differently? Could we have done things better? And, of course, it would be nice if all of that could be examined properly in the public inquiry, and I'm sure it will be examined properly. The issue is that there is no deadline for that public inquiry. I've looked at its terms of reference. They are basically a lifetime's work for a lot of people. My fear is that we won't get answers for many, many years. I would have thought a decade is optimistic. So when Sir Keir Starmer earlier this week suggested that the inquiry report by the end of the year, I thought that was a very good plan. I
think we'd all like to see that and certainly would applaud that if it could happen. You wrote the book, of course, with Matt Hancock. I think in the run-up to release, and once the book came out, you'd been sort of broadly positive about the job that he had done and what he had tried to do. And then all of a sudden, a few months later, you feel compelled to ignore the NDA and release these WhatsApp messages for the reasons that you've outlined. But what changed, Isabel? Had you not had a chance to sort of really, truly see the scale of what was in the WhatsApp messages as you were writing that book?
Well, the answer to that is quite simply yes. I didn't actually get these WhatsApp messages until very well into the process of writing a book that was being done against a ridiculously tight deadline. I mean, to produce a book of 160,000 words, which is about twice the length of a normal political book, within less than a year is a phenomenal undertaking. To then receive this dump of messages last summer was just a mountain that was impossible to climb. There's 2.3 million words there, 100,000 or more messages between ministers and all the key players. Even Matt Hancock himself hasn't got a clue about what's in half of that material. It's taken a Telegraph team of about 10 brilliant journalists working full-time to go through all of that with a fine-tooth comb and find things that I didn't know existed.
I mean, the word that is being bandied around on both sides is betrayal, isn't it? Either betrayal of we, the public, by people that we were trusting at the time to make decisions and the tone in which they were discussing things that have impacted all of us so much when we look at your WhatsApp messages, or your betrayal of Matt Hancock. How do you sit with your position? Did you call him before you released them? Did you explain it? Did you go back to the publishers and say, I now feel conflicted? You know, talk us through your situation.
I think that's a really fair question. And people can decide for themselves which is more important. Is it more important for me as a journalist to protect the blushes and the reputation of self-interested politicians, all of whom are, by the way, hiring lawyers to protect their interests during this public inquiry? Or is it more important for me to reveal information that affected every single one of us? That is where I think my duty is in this case. Of course, there are risks associated with breaking written agreements. It wasn't an NDA, by the way. That's a kind of a boring legal distinction, but a confidentiality undertaking in a written contract. I'm prepared to take that risk in the public interest. And if I take a few knocks from people carping about the way it's been done, then that's also fine by me. The amount of messages that I am getting from ordinary people who are still suffering the devastating impact of the pandemic is so encouraging and really makes me feel that I've done the right thing here.
Well, that must be helpful as you sort of try and think about yourself at the centre of the whirlwind. What about this word trust? Trust for them, you've talked about, that you felt because of concerns over that, the politicians, you wanted to come out and release them. But also, I guess, trust in you, not just in breaking the trust about Hancock, but in the position that you come from. So you were always against lockdown. A lot of these messages are around decisions that we were making at a very busy time when the facts were unclear. We now have the benefit of hindsight. Maybe things would have been done differently. And there could well be many more things in those WhatsApp that wouldn't suit, if you like, your agenda.
Well, let's talk about trust, shall we? Because I think far too many people trusted our politicians to protect our best interests during the pandemic, and those people are now really questioning whether they should have put so much faith in our leaders, as these WhatsApp messages show the dreadfully flimsy prospectus on which we were often locked down, the flawed decision-making, and so on. And in terms of trust,
Isabel,
in terms of trust of me,
I take your point. Sorry,
in terms of trust of me, because I know you want to talk about that.
But you talk about, you know, the evidence, but it could have gone a different way. There's lots of criticisms of the delay in preventing people coming into this country, lots of criticisms of whether lockdown should have happened earlier. You know, you happen to think that the lockdown was wrong, and therefore you're talking about those sort of things. Whatever comes out of a crisis like this, there's going to be for and against in those discussions, isn't there?
Of course there is. Of course there is. And look, I happen to think it was right to lock down at the very beginning. We needed to do that. In a sense, it doesn't matter what I personally think. What matters is that we get to the heart of what went right and what went wrong. And in terms of trust of me, look, I don't think that people should trust anyone to protect their secrets if they've done things wrong.
You said the other night, not long after it had been announced that this was going to happen in the Telegraph, that you'd received a somewhat menacing text from Matt Hancock at about 1:20 in the morning. He's denied that. He said it wasn't menacing, or he didn't believe that it was menacing at all. Have you had any further contact with him?
I really think this whole menacing message thing has been a bit overinflated. I'm not frightened or intimidated. It wasn't.
They were your words, though, weren't they?
It simply said at 1:20 in the morning, you have made a big mistake. Look, you can't really interpret that as anything other than a threat. He's since followed through with more threats of legal action and so on, but I'm not worried about that. I'm not going to be intimidated or blown off course by that. You know, this is much more important than those considerations. Have you found more to come? I mean, what is next that's in there? Can you give us a sense of it? Because presumably you're working your way through all the messages. No, the Telegraph has spent 2 months working their way through all the messages, so we know exactly what's in there. We've been very careful only to publish what material is clearly in the public interest. There's plenty in those messages that we as journalists and the public might find very entertaining, good tittle-tattle, private stuff. It's not in the public interest. We won't be publishing it. But we do have several more days of coverage planned. And what's extraordinarily interesting is that politicians are now beginning to break ranks. So we had yesterday Gavin Williamson, who was the Education Secretary at the time of all of this, saying, actually, maybe I should have resigned over the way school policy was handled and the closure of schools. Today, we've got Rachel Johnson, the sister of the then Prime Minister, writing about what she calls her unquenchable rage at the treatment of the elderly who were imprisoned in care homes, unable to see their relatives. Politicians and others are beginning to break ranks. Those who didn't question the lockdown at the time now beginning to say, actually, maybe we got this wrong. There's definitely debate. Are you being paid by the Daily Telegraph for it? Otherwise, why wouldn't you just reveal all the rest to come now for free to us? That's a question we've been asked by viewers, by the way. I've spent a very long time working on this with the Daily Telegraph, and I am a working journalist, so of course I am paid for my contributions, just as you're paid to sit on television and talk to me about them. But I'm not going to go into detail about that commercial arrangement at all. It's a normal situation for a journalist to be paid to write. I've appeared under my own byline in the paper for the last few days. OK, Isabel, thanks for joining us this morning and sharing some thoughts. We'll look forward to seeing what comes further from that over the weekend. Lots of you getting in
Church Anne says, at last a journalist has lifted the lid on the goings-on during the worst time of so many in these lives. I applaud her. While WAF says it's the end of her journalistic career. No one is ever going to trust her with information or evidence ever again.
I wonder if they feel differently having heard what she has to say.